Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon for the keynote lecture number 5. The topic of the keynote lecture number 5 is turning good intentions to concrete actions. You remember that GRF Davos has in the logo from thoughts to action, and therefore I was very pleased to see the title, Turning Good Intentions to Concrete Actions. The keynote will be delivered by Nikhil SETH. Mr. SETH is Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations International Training and Research Center in Geneva. Before taking over that responsibility in Geneva, Mr. SETH was the Director of the Division for Sustainable Development, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, at the United Nations Secretariat in New York. In this role, he served as head of the Rio+20 Secretariat and of the Secretariat for the Third International Conference on Small Island Developing States, spearheading the preparations for these conferences in Rio. Mr. SETH was also responsible for supporting the intergovernmental negotiations for the post-2015 development agenda. I'm very pleased to have you with us, Mr. SETH, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Walter, not only for your introduction, but for inviting me to come and speak at this conference. Let me start by an introduction and why I titled what I'm going to say, Turning Good Intentions to Concrete Actions. I've been at the UN for over 2.5 decades, and I seem to have spent most of my adult life in conceptualizing development agendas, which included Copenhagen Summit, the Rio Summit of 1992, the Beijing Plan of Action for Women's Advancement, and most recently by the Rio+20 Summit, by the Samoa Conference, which Walter mentioned, and of course in creating the Sustainable Development Goals. Now I've come to a capacity where I have to shift away from conceptualizing these agendas in helping governments reach a consensus on plans of action into actually making it a reality in the lives of people. And that is a much bigger challenge than conceptualizing agendas with a beautiful form of words which enjoy the consensus of 193 member states. So that's why I said, let me title my talk, Moving from These Good Intentions into Concrete Actions, and how do we do it? But let me start, of course, by mentioning that what we adopted last year, whether it was in Sendai or in Addis Ababa, where the Financing for Development Conference was held, to New York, where there was the biggest summit ever on the Sustainable Development Goals, over 160 heads of state and government. I think the heads of state and government of each one of the countries represented in the room today were there. And, of course, the Paris COP21 and the outcome of Paris COP21. These together, in my mind, in the almost 3 decades I've been with the UN, are the most ambitious blueprint that the UN has ever adopted on the issues of sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, of climate change adaptation and mitigation. And these are, of course, not discrete outcomes. These are strongly interlinked outcomes. And what we need to do now is to move from this conceptualization into implementing them. The world now has a vision and a concrete plan of action. We have a vision which embraces the period from 2016 to 2030 through a set of goals, 17 goals, through a set of targets, 169 targets, and a set of indicators to measure whether we are on track in reaching these goals and targets. There are over 220 of them. So we have a bold and ambitious plan of action, but what will be the gaps between the realization of these goals and targets and the ambition that was embodied in what was adopted last year? This is what I want to talk about today. And the two significant gaps I want to talk about is the gap between global promises and national actions. And second is the gap between long-term agendas and the constant shocks, the economic shocks, the social shocks, the environmental shocks, and the political shocks which throw us off target with a regular frequency. These are the gaps I will talk about today, and I will focus specifically on the tools available to make the great transitions the world needs. How can we break from the past approaches and apply the lessons and values of the outcomes that I referred to make our world resilient, to make our world responsive, and fully awake to the severe challenges posed by climate change and by disaster risk? During the course of this conference, I've seen the agenda, I've attended some of the parallel sessions. Many of you have focused on the minutiae of disaster risk reduction, of disaster management, and so on. But I want to start with a slightly broader picture, because after all, sustainable development and the realization of sustainable development, an irreversible end to poverty, are all parts of a long-term program for disaster risk reduction. And an irreversible end to poverty is possible only along a sustainable development pathway. Climate change and disaster risk are fundamental challenges, and as we have seen in country after country, these can roll back decades of development. 250 million people are affected annually by disasters associated with natural hazards, both geophysical and hydrometeorological events. Climate change has slow onset features as well as an impact on the intensity of extreme weather events. Its biggest impact is on hunger and food security. Mortality rates may be falling, but economic losses, as I've heard during these conferences, are rising significantly. They were $100 million annually a year ago when we did this research while preparing for the SDGs, but they will be almost $200 billion annually by 2030. Lives and livelihoods are lost, pushing more and more people into extreme poverty, with the most vulnerable, as always, paying the highest price. Now, what has happened in the last 30 years which gives us hope? I think what has been most significant in development thinking over the last 30 years is the incorporation of climate change action and disaster risk reduction into development thinking. These have entered public investment planning systems, sectoral plans, social protection and infrastructure investments, post-recovery planning, and humanitarian actions. Moreover, all the development approaches now recognize the need for, firstly, a deeper engagement using the whole of government and whole of society approaches. We can't expect central governments to deliver on everything. And in the increasing realization is still we involve governments, of course, centrally in the whole of government approach, where different line ministries talk to each other, where different systems of governance talk to each other, but also whole of society approaches, where all actors in civil society are conversing with each other. And that came out very strongly in the presentation at the last plenary when we heard about Japan's experiences post-Sendai. The importance of partnership and citizen participation, the engagement of the private sector, the engagement of academia, the engagement of city planners and governments together in preparing for and responding to disasters. The second big lesson we've learned in the last 30 years is the need to integrate targets and model goals and targets achievement. Everything is interlinked. You can't just respond to a water crisis. You have to look at the whole matrix of issues which are integrated together. The importance, of course, that we've learned in these last 30 years is of urban planning and urban development. We've learned on climate change of minimizing its impact with a drastic reduction, if possible, on GHG emissions. And of course, as part of this development thinking changes, there's a stronger emphasis than ever before on disaster risk management as opposed to disaster management and the need to strengthen resilience of people. We've also learned of the importance of the resilience of the health and education infrastructure. We've also learned that we need to build back better. And we have also, the donor community and development cooperation has been much better informed now of risk-informed donor support and development. These important conceptual changes and shifts in development thinking need to permeate the consciousness of decision makers at all levels. And my questions, which I want to answer to the two gaps I talked about, the gaps between global intentions and national actions, and the gaps which result from frequent shocks and what it does to long-term thinking, how do these mindset changes take place? That is what I would like to address today. The cornerstone of meaningful actions will be at the national and subnational and local levels. These include all aspects of implementation of the agendas that we've promised the world, including in its implementation, its review, its monitoring, and evaluation. The four actions, I think, that are most immediate are first, ensuring that national plans and national budgets have accounted for disaster risk and climate change. Second, all countries need to create systems and mechanisms for multi-stakeholder engagement at the national level and at the local level. Strengthening of national statistical capacity to ensure that disaggregated data and evidence base for policies is well established. And finally, a better understanding of the goal target modeling and the relationship which what have been treated as goals in silos, where poverty, where health, where education, where gender advancement and equality, where respect for our terrestrial ecosystems, respect for our water systems, respect for our marine ecosystems, for developing infrastructure that is resilient. All of these have been treated in silos rather than an integrated system which ultimately impact on the various things we want to address for the betterment of lives. All these actions, these four actions that I mentioned, national planning and national budgeting, creating systems of multi-stakeholder engagement, creating statistical capacity, and better understanding of the interaction between different goals and targets, these have to be mirrored very strongly at the local level, at the urban and the city level. There has to be a special emphasis on safe, resilient, and sustainable cities and human settlements. The goal 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals, the outcomes from Sendai and the forthcoming Quito conference, place great emphasis on reducing the number of deaths and economic losses caused by disasters, especially water-related disasters, which focus on relief to the most vulnerable. Adoption of city plans for climate change adaptation, resilience, holistic disaster risk management, resilient buildings, emergency response planning, including evacuation and early warning, are some of the many urgent actions. We heard all this in the most practical way by different components of the Japanese presentation, from the deputy mayor, from the private sector, from the others, from academia. All that has to be factored in at an early stage at the local level. But I think in the long run, given the demographic trends that the world is seeing, where we expect in the next 30 years, the 70% of the world to be living in urban areas, most of this growth will take place in developing countries, particularly in Asia. I think the bulk of this growth is going to take place in developing countries in Asia. That is one thing that has to be our special focus as we plan for urban human settlements of the future. What we need most desperately and urgently is better land use planning, an ending of chaotic, unplanned urban sprawls, and working to achieve different relevant targets from among these various SDGs and the Sendai framework and the soon-to-be adopted Quito Plan of Action. Many of the targets and the indicators that have been adopted focus on these issues. They focus on measuring the number of people affected. They focus on measuring the economic losses caused by disasters. They focus on measuring the number of cities that are making plans for disaster risk reduction. All these are very important indicators because, after all, we treasure what we measure. And if we are going to measure these things, societies in planning for the future will factor in all these things, particularly for urban development. Without an energetic response at the national level, every other brick at the regional or global level will be precariously perched. The national actions gap is the most urgent, for which a massive effort is called for. All of you who can influence national planning in your own countries must focus on the need to bring this high up on planning and in budgeting processes in your countries. Because without that focus, it is lost, because then we will again become responding to crises as they emerge and not planning for them. And our ability to factor in these changes based on the vision that the world has given through these wonderful outcomes that we adopted last year is going to be absolutely crucial for the future of our responses to inevitable increases in natural and other disasters. I think in the development cooperation side also, donors need to factor in much more actively the kind of support they are giving to developing countries by bringing in aspects of climate change and disaster risk management very much more strongly and upfront in the kind of development cooperation they have. There are some indicators, for example, which focus on the support to LDCs, the least developed countries, going in areas of building resilient buildings, and that sort of attention should not be lost to the political expediency in the domain of aid and development cooperation. So that's my first message, really, that if we are going to make these global ambitions and dreams a reality, we need much more strong action at the national, local, subnational levels, guided by review processes which keep the pressure on at the global level, with peer exchanges which take place at the regional level, because there's no substitute for peer learning when it comes to learning about disaster management. Many of the questions that came, for example, in the last panel, which was a presentation from Japan, a country which has great experience in the area of disaster risk management, came from developing countries who said that, look, how are we going to manage? We are poor countries. We don't have deep pockets. We can't do the kinds of things you're doing in retrofitting of buildings, in planning for the future. What can we do, given our resource base, to be equally well equipped to handle our disasters? But I think the answer is really the ingenuity of our own national planners, our city planners, our urban planners, and the way in which they can cope with the resource constraints that operate at these countries to see how they can use the best that is available to them, given their resource constraints, to make all this possible. The second thing I wanted to talk about is coping with shocks. The constant, sometimes daily shocks in the economic, social, and environmental arenas have become our new normal. Each day we expect to pick up the newspaper and read of some new shock which is hitting the world. It could be a financial shock. It could be a shock in terms of a natural disaster. It could be a social upheaval, civil strife, political convulsions, spreading to swathes of countries. All this is creating waves of movement of people. Anti-globalization, anti-free trade, ultra-nationalist forces keep rearing their ugly heads. Social strife, discrimination, unequal and unjust societies are having profound impacts on our conventional understanding of order and stability. Terrorism and the associated losses and disruption threaten all parts of the world. Hydrometeorological events visit us in an increasing frequency. Extreme weather variations hit our world often. Food insecurity and hunger stalk large parts of the world. The attendant movement of desperate people adds one more layer of uncertainty and diverts attention from long-term plans. So my message is, how does the world continue to be on a long-term agenda when all these so-called urgent priorities are taking our energies and our imagination and our resources away from these long-term agendas. And the lack of attention to these long-term agendas were in the first place responsible for the strife that we find ourselves in. What I would like to see in this world, of course, is that these urgent long-term priorities are not sacrificed on the altar of urgent priorities. In fact, if there's any budgetary item which needs to be probably looked at, is the military expenditures, which are growing exponentially at the expense of all other expenditures. Or if you look at any national budget, you'll find that the only element of stability and growth are military budgets, and all other, whether it's education, empowerment of women, irreversible ends to poverty, all those are sacrificed at the altar of military expenditures. If we don't continue with long-term agendas, what we're going to end up with 2030 is not the realization of the 2030 agenda. We'll end up with bleaker economics, bleaker politics, bleaker state of our societies, a bleaker state of our environment, and continuing devastating consequences of climate change and disasters. So, in the broad brush perspective, of course, all of you are more experts on the minutiae of the disaster risk, but this is the broad picture I wanted to first paint for you. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in their entirety, not cherry-picking on some of these goals, but achieving them in their entirety is the only way of guaranteeing resilient societies and resilient people, resilient economies, and climate change and disaster risk is the thread which runs through the goals, through all of them. But let me mention just a few. Whether it's sustainable agriculture and food security, whether it's sustainable energy for all, whether it's sustainable water management, whether it's building resilient infrastructure, whether it's building sustainable cities, or sustainable consumption and production patterns, or combating climate change, the goals on our marine and terrestrial ecosystems, these are all discrete goals in the Sustainable Development Goals. Unless all these are achieved together, these are all vital for disasters and climate change. So please see the goals and our ambition to achieve resilient societies as an integrated matrix of interlinked goals. Progress on one goal will determine progress on the others. They are all interlinked. We should not, as I mentioned before, cherry pick focus attention on just one goal. Some say that let's focus first on goal 16, which is the creation of peaceful and just societies. But you can't create peaceful and just societies unless you end poverty irreversibly. You can't do that unless you end hunger. You can't create peaceful and just societies without ensuring water for all, without ensuring sanitation for all. So these are indivisible goals which we have to try and achieve together. I now want to shift to the last part of what I need to say, which is on the tools for risk mapping, for urban planning and awareness. And here I want to talk not so much of what we talked in the last plenary meeting, where we talked about the role of media, we talked about the role of social media, we talked about the role of mobile telephony, we talked about citizens' actions, we talked about partnerships. These have been covered in a sense. I will draw your attention to the types of things my little organization, which is the UN Institute for Training and Research, we do, and many of them relate to satellite applications and geospatial information systems. And I want to talk about those and the potential they have in many of the areas of disaster management and risk reduction that we have been talking about. I personally have a great faith in the power of new technologies, in the power of new communications, in the power of the internet revolution, and particularly in the developing world, of the deep penetration of mobile telephony, which has one of the greatest potentials in the areas that we are specifically looking at in this conference. Of course, classical surveying still plays a role in accurate infrastructure mapping and planning. There is a need to collect data over large areas at low cost and use this to derive information of first hazard and subsequent risk mapping. Our UN Satellite Applications Program, UNOSAT, does just that. We've been supporting the full disaster management cycle from preparedness to response, recovery, and development for the last 15 years. We are hosted at CERN, which straddles France and Switzerland. in Geneva, with regional presence in Chad, in Nairobi, and in Bangkok. The program ensures a practical focus on applying geospatial information technologies, both through its own analysis and in transferring that knowledge to countries that have limited expertise and resources in the field. Disaster risk reduction is an integral part of the disaster management cycle and a key strategic area for UNOSAT based on increasing demands from countries. These needs relate both to help during disasters, but even more to develop their capacities in reducing risks and responding to disasters themselves. I would like to illustrate these with a few practical examples of the type of things we've done in various countries. In East Africa, we work together with IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, to develop capacity in the use of geospatial information technologies. After over 4 years of working with them, I was pleased to see how data were collected and information shared during the recent El Nino in East Africa. IGAD and UNOSAT, working hand in hand, shared up-to-date information on flood and drought risks through an easy-to-access web map platform. Coupled with development of geographic information systems, GIS databases, training and supply of satellite imagery covering the whole region, IGAD informed its member states through existing mechanisms on the status of El Nino, including daily flood risk updates. Similar activities take place in Asia, where capacity is developed in Myanmar, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. I would also like to highlight our support towards early warning. Unless warnings reach the affected populations, they're of course no use. You know, at the earlier panel, a question was asked, what are the early warning mechanisms that need to be put into place? And I think mobile telephony, once again, offers a great opportunity. Pre-disaster, post-disaster, the impact on the towers and so on could disrupt mobile telephony. But I see no reason why, mobile penetration is so deep in most parts of the developing world, including the poorest countries, that if there was a mechanism for sending early warning through people's mobile telephones, as it exists in many countries, and we are partnering with the World Meteorological Organization and the ITU to try and develop that so that all poor people, especially those who are handicapped, have access to advanced information on hurricanes and tsunamis and whatever at a time so that they can get access to higher ground well in advance. So that's one way in which we can, of course, help. We also have a flood finder system through partnerships with the Research Foundation in Italy, the US Geological Survey, and CERN. We were able to forecast flooded areas 3 weeks in advance, both alerting relevant actors and also programming cloud-penetrating radar satellite image monitoring the situation. This is being done as we speak in Chad, in collaboration with the Ministries of Territorial Planning and Hydraulics, as well as with UNICEF, and there's a UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and there's a global framework for climate services. These are a lot of acronyms in the UN, but I wanted to give you a sense that we are working very closely in the UN to deliver these services to help people, particularly the most vulnerable and those that are furthest behind in the poorest countries. Another example of early warning is drought monitoring in Papua New Guinea. That was also linked to El Nino and climate change. And we did work and we helped the government to map out the change in vegetation patterns and give them drought indicators through satellite imagery. We provided them in a very timely fashion and contributed to giving them information on the food security issues related on the affected areas. In the area of disaster response, we are involved in about 35 events every year. We helped the government of Ecuador at the time of the earthquake. We helped the Fijian government at the time of Hurricane Winston. And we are always there, to be able to provide advanced and satellite imagery to help them analyze the impact of disasters and so on. This not only helps manage emergency situation, but also helps build back better in recovery and reconstruction. There is also the whole issue of sustainable development and the long-term issues relating to sustainable development. In Chad, in close in cooperation with the Ministry of Hydraulics and the University of Jamena, and the Swiss Development Cooperation, we are developing capacities in sustainable water management. We've mapped their entire freshwater resource base in Chad, and we hope to complete those maps in a long-term project, which is going to be going on for another 6-7 years, or it's another 8 years, that we hope to have for Chad a full map of their hydraulic resources. Innovation is fundamental, and we are doing a lot of experimentation in this. We are working with the University of Geneva, we are working with the Graduate Institute to try and get real-time information through telephone, through the mobile apps, through photographs, to get situational coverage of what can potentially become difficult situations by looking at the health of livestock. That's a great way, if we have photo images of the livestock, of saying whether a famine is coming or whether there is urgent need to address the needs of, we have developed several tools, including something we call the GeoTag X. We've given it a modern kind of name, tool to allow specific tasks using open source technologies. We believe in the power of crowdsourcing information, of bringing them to a common database, of sharing them with people, of finding local solutions to local problems. Of course, in the UN, we tend to look at things very globally and internationally, but there's an increasing realization, particularly in the area of disasters and climate change, that you have to find local solutions, and you have to engage local communities in finding local solutions. So all the tools we are trying to develop now are based in these particular areas. Our mission in the UN is to help eradicate poverty in all its forms everywhere. The world has promised to do it by 2030. UNITAR is doing its bit by looking at the various parts of this 2030 agenda and seeing how can we, through training, through capacity building, through knowledge, through a public awareness, through changing people's mindsets, how can we bring this to make it a reality for the poorest, the most vulnerable countries, including small islands, least developed countries, groups of most vulnerable people, including aging, including the older person, including the handicapped, both physically handicapped and mentally handicapped. And that's our mission. And we are there to help, and we are there looking for partnerships to be able to multiply and amplify this capacity building. And contact us, speak to us, and we'll be happy for those who want to develop those partnerships to consider and carry on with this mission. So I thank you very much, and I hope you have a successful rest of meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nikhil. Thank you very much, Nikhil SETH, for a very inspiring keynote, showing the importance of the national, regional, local level to form the puzzle at the national level, which then forms up to the overall global picture. Thank you very much for this inspiring input, for many fruits for thought, I'm sure.